And yet, here I am. I'm not about to be silenced. I'm still talking to you about why polar bears didn't die off as predicted, and I plan to continue to do so. But one final question that I think still needs to be asked, and that's how many polar bears are really out there? I've noticed that polar bear specialists from the Polar Bear Specialist Group have been minimizing estimates of the global polar bear population for decades. And this is the same sea ice graph that I've showed earlier. And what the polar bear biologists seem to be suggesting is that since the 1960s, when the polar bear numbers were, somewhere around 10,000, that the numbers went up until about 1995 or 96, and then have leveled off ever since. And I would suggest to you that this is biologically implausible, and that it's very likely that, in fact, the numbers have continued to increase, and that we're just not seeing it, partly because some of the populations have not been surveyed, and that we don't have concrete numbers for them. And what the biologists are doing is really lowballing their estimates for those populations. So I would contend then that a plausible scientific estimate at about 2018 is around 39,000, with a fairly broad range of 26,000 to 58,000. Now, I base this using a kind of geographical model of extrapolation, looking at populations within one region that have had a recent and fairly decent scientific assessment or estimate, and then using that to extrapolate for some of the populations in Russia and for East Greenland, for instance, that have never been surveyed. So that's the kind of number I came up with. And some people have suggested to me that, gee, maybe this is a little outrageous. But in fact, one of the things that I've come across is that in 1986, Canadian polar bear specialist Ian Sterling stated there was probably about 40,000 bears in the world, using exactly the same criteria I did. If you made a decent estimate for the areas that had not had a survey, and use that to come up with a global total. And in fact, if his estimate was true in 1986, 39,000 as the current average, with a potential for 58,000 maximum, is likely a conservative estimate after more than 30 years. And I contend that, in fact, there is no climate emergency for polar bears. The canary in the coal mine for climate change turned out to be an outstanding survivor of climate change. But what does this mean for Arctic residents? There's some real repercussions. There is more polar bears now in the Arctic than there has been in 50 years. And what we're seeing is that these dangerous predators are killing people, and they're doing, in fact, a lot of damage that we never hear of in the media in their relentless quest for food. They will damage these snow machines. They've gotten attraction for anything vinyl. They'll rip up things. They'll kill dogs and dog teams. And even fat polar bears will kill people and damage property. And what it means is that polar bears are actually now a danger year-round. It used to be maybe only in the summer. Now we're seeing the population so high that bears are starting to visit communities virtually every month of the year. And just to give you an example of some incidents that I found in the media around Svalbard in fairly recent years. In July of 2018, you may have remembered hearing about a tour guide that was attacked by an emaciated polar bear on a remote island in the Barents Sea. And this fellow was a polar bear guard. He was there to search out the beach to make sure there was no polar bears, so that tourists could come ashore to look at birds. But he was ambushed by this bear, even though he had a gun, and it was only because his partner, who had a gun, was right there, that he avoided being seriously mauled or killed. In August 2016, an archaeological site on one of the islands had to stop for pretty much all day as a couple of polar bears had a good look around to see what was going on. In another incident, in a remote cabin, a polar bear just ripped off the door of the cabin by its hinges and then ransacked the interior. And this is an incident from this summer, where a couple of fellows were just going out for cruising around, and they stopped to have lunch on the beach and go for a bit of a walk. When they looked back, they saw this bear had climbed into their boat, and this is what he did to the interior. Now, like so many of these incidents, it was blamed on climate change in the media, blamed on a lack of sea ice due to climate change. But in fact, like most of these stories, when you look at the specific sea ice conditions at the time, it just doesn't hold water. And it turns out that the ice around Svalbard this summer has been higher than it's been in decades. And so blaming this particular incident on lack of sea ice seems a little ludicrous.